Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A True American Patriot by Daniel J. O'Connor, narrated by Graham Rowat. Chapter 1. On Your 6 O'Clock. They were in the air approaching Dubai International Airport in the United Arab Emirates. The professor, a little-known but very powerful world figure in certain foreign capitals, stared out the airplane window at the unfolding cityscape like a child, checking boxes in his mind. He always liked to mentally catalog interesting buildings by name, height, and style. The plane was now in descent. The professor had been here many times, but not recently. Now, the array of skyscrapers that stretched out before him was even more incredible than he remembered. The tallest building in the world, since 2010, was in Dubai. It was 2,716 feet tall and was called the Burj Khalifa. After passing through customs and immigration, the professor and his colleague moved into a waiting limousine. The ride to Abu Dhabi would take about 1.5 hours. Traveling bumpily through the desert, they passed elderly vendors selling bottled water strung on the backs of camels. In the desert, water is the key to survival. Fortunately, their driver had ensured the car was already well stocked. Once they arrived in Abu Dhabi, they once again passed buildings that were shining and new. The place didn't match the sheer density of Dubai, but Abu Dhabi was quickly growing into a remarkable modern metropolis. The professor knew that the rest of the Arab world would one day look like this. The professor covertly held the level of a U.S. cabinet official with special status. He had near-instant access to the President of the United States, and a select number of kings, prime ministers, queens, and heads of terrorist networks also knew him well. He was considered a brilliant mathematician who understood not only numbers, but also the hidden algorithms of human motivation. The U.S. president regarded the professor as a kind of national treasure. Therefore, POTUS ensured that the professor's personal background was kept secure. It was shared only with those who really had a need to know. The professor provided intelligence to the president. He was a force multiplier and had prevented nuclear, chemical, and biological attacks on the U.S. on more than one occasion. None of these threats had ever been made public, of course. The professor was also a patriot. He had no desire for praise or recognition. He had only an unwavering desire to see the enemies of his country fail. It was a mild evening, and the professor was scheduled to meet with a longtime friend and high-level government official in the lobby of the Emirates Palace Hotel, followed by a relaxed dinner. As usual, Devlin "Doc" O'Connell was at the professor's side. Doc always wore a subtle half-smile, a mini-smile that adversaries invariably found impossible to interpret. He was the professor's security advisor, protector, and close friend. Doc had learned a long time ago to never ignore his innate judgment, a combination of instinct and practice honed over long years. From the hard streets of the Bronx to the mud huts of Afghanistan, Doc often felt threats prior to actually seeing them. In this instance, while getting off the elevator in the lobby with the professor, Doc instantly knew they were in danger. The hotel lobby was loaded with guests and friends, and the noise level was barely manageable. Staff personnel were practically sprinting back and forth to fulfill requests. Doc surveyed the area and knew in a matter of seconds that there were 2, maybe 3 assassins present. The variable was a woman dressed in a full burqa. The men were clearly professionals, trained and hard, and trying their best to look bored. Doc could not immediately determine whether the woman was in or out, making her potentially the most lethal threat of all. As Doc and the professor moved through the lobby, all 3 were standing in fixed positions. They stayed in place as the professor walked eagerly toward the main entrance to greet his old friend, who was just pulling up in a brand-new Level 5 armored Mercedes-Benz. The Advance was the car in front, and security personnel were jumping out as it coasted in. More security officers were on foot and had been waiting at the entrance. With a subtle nod, they gave the green light. Safe. The next vehicle then rolled in, carrying the principal, who was waving on the inside of the bullet-resistant glass and smiling at the professor. An armored SUV that carried 5 armed, highly trained security officers with locked and loaded automatic weapons at the ready also rolled in, watching everything and everyone. A minute before, the first assassin had walked behind Doc and the professor in the lobby at a reasonable distance as they went out the large glass doors of the main entrance. Doc noted the large bumps under his clothing and identified 2 automatic weapons. An MP5 submachine gun was hidden under his right side for spraying, and another was wrapped around his left side. The assassin was also cupping a stun grenade. The second assassin had somehow quietly gotten ahead of them and was waiting outside the Palace Hotel. Doc spotted him by the long gun peeking out of a car window. He was the sniper. He had the right angle and was vectored generally on the entrance. Doc moved around the side of the professor so that the sniper would have less of a target and be forced to reevaluate his shot. Doc's biggest concern was still the female assassin who was floating around somewhere and was now out of sight. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse. She was walking purposefully out of the rear right side entrance, not yet near the motorcade, but heading in that direction. The choreography was now in full motion. The first assassin threw his grenade at the SUV and then engaged the security officers with his 2 hidden MP5s. The team leader was opening the motorcade door, and the principal was turning his body to exit. Doc's instinct took over. He grabbed the professor and hurled him into the limousine, just as a large-caliber bullet whizzed by his head. The sniper's bullet proceeded to blow the team leader's head off. Doc launched himself over the professor's body, and once inside the car, he threw the Abu Dhabi government official down on top of the professor while pulling the door shut. With everyone pressed on the floor wells of the vehicle, he yelled at the driver to gun it. The car's tires squealed like a free stallion suddenly spooked. A few seconds later, they made it to the fastest lane of the highway at top speed. The female assassin had by now made it to the center of the Palace Hotel entrance and detonated the strapped-on bomb that had been concealed by her robes. The blast, it would later be determined, killed at least 100 people, including the entire security detail. The front of the hotel collapsed, floors pancaking one on top of another. It was a scene from hell. From the speeding car, Doc called the American embassy using a secure radio code and advised the Marine Guards there that they were running hot, had 2 government principals, 1 U.S. official and 1 other high-level UAE government official, along with 1 local security driver en route. Doc requested an expedited entry through the rear gate. He provided a quick situation report and ordered the embassy to immediately raise the threat level to maximum. The Marines sprang into action and were waiting for Doc's armored Mercedes when it pulled up a few minutes later. At the rear embassy gate, they saw Doc's face and waved the Mercedes in while covering the surrounding area. Once secured within the embassy compound, the first task at hand was to figure out whom the hit team was after, the professor, the foreign government official, or both. Doc made some phone calls and set up an emergency exfiltration plan for the professor and himself. The UAE government official was transported to his own compound by another armored motorcade, accompanied by military assault teams and a couple of tanks on both ends. In 3 hours, the professor and Doc were wheels up on a foreign private government jet back to the U.S. All markings had been removed. The flight home would take 16 hours. A carefully prepared security venue in the U.S. would serve to protect the professor and Doc for a short while until they had an exact grasp of the enemy they were up against. Chapter 2. The Cat of 9 Lives. In flight, and after some heavy sleeping, the professor thanked Doc profusely for saving his life and that of his close friend. Doc nodded nonchalantly as if accepting a cup of coffee. The professor asked Doc if he thought he, the professor, was the primary target of the attack. Doc responded that it would all take some time to analyze. He noted that the team was well trained and fully committed. He told the professor that the 3-person assassination team had picked them up in the lobby and trailed them outside. They clearly had foreknowledge of the professor's and Doc's presence and time in town, plus the exact timing of the arrival of the senior foreign government official's motorcade. If the assassination team were only after the foreign government official, it would have made more tactical sense to set up outside the main entrance and simply hit the official when he exited the vehicle. Doc went on to explain to the professor some of what surfaced once things were in motion. The first assassin who threw the stun grenade at the SUV and then engaged the local security detail was a diversion. Otherwise, that shooter could and would have tried to kill the official himself, as well as Doc and the professor. But he did no such thing. Assassin number 1 was successful in his objective. The sniper, assassin number 2, fired at the moment when the official started to lift off his seat in the car. "At that point," said Doc, "we were all in his line of sight. When I lifted you into the armored car and threw you beneath the foreign official, it served 2 purposes: to reverse the official's momentum and to get the vehicle off the X as soon as possible." While the professor pondered all of these factors, Doc said that, again, it would take some time to determine the hit team's actual target. He said that it was unlikely that both the professor and the foreign dignitary were targets, as the chances of success would have been diminished. Meanwhile, despite the failure of the assassination attempt, the assassin team was still successful in literally taking down the Palace Hotel and ending many lives in the process. The propaganda and media outlets would no doubt give this incident both domestic and global coverage for some time. This was generally what the terrorists wanted. The professor asked Doc what his personal instinct said as to who the primary intended target was. Doc paused for a minute, looked directly at the professor, and asked if he was really sure that he wanted an answer to his question. Yes, he was sure. Doc nodded slowly, but first asked the professor if he had ever heard the joke about 2 guys in the woods and an angry bear. The professor shook his head. Doc told the story. 2 guys were walking in the woods, and suddenly a very large bear appeared out of nowhere and was 5 yards from them. The bear diligently smelled the air twice and suddenly began chasing them. Of course, both men immediately started running as fast as possible. While doing so, the one guy asked the other guy what they did to arouse the beast. The other guy never answered his question, but he picked up their pace of running as the bear was getting closer. Finally, while huffing and puffing, the first guy asked the second if he thought they could outrun the bear. Guy number 2 answered that he did not need to outrun the bear. He just needed to outrun him. The first guy then did his best to keep up, but found himself dropping back. The bear was now right behind him. He mentally prepared himself for his own death as he slowed even more. To his surprise, the bear ran directly by him and continued his chase after the second guy. The point of the story was that many threats are general in nature. Focused threats are very different. They are often initially taken as general, but this is a disguise. They are actually pointed and personal. The attacker, or attackers, is going after the scent and will not stop until he is either successful or is put down. Doc said that his feeling thus far was that the professor was the primary target. The fact that the assassin team waited until the motorcade arrived was camouflage. Instead, they vectored onto you personally, he said, but looked to the motorcade as a disguise that would not let their true objective be obvious. All 3 were professionals, and the operation was carefully executed. The fatal explosion was also meant as backup. It was another means to hide the fact that you, the professor, were the target in case the sniper missed. The professor sat back and pondered it all, and then asked Doc, "What about right now?" "They will still come for you, as it is likely personal. Whoever this group is, you are being hunted, and they will not stop." Pressed by the professor, Doc conceded that in his judgment, the unseen enemy was likely Al-Qaeda. The operation matched their tactics and typical objectives. Moreover, the risk had not abated, as their sense of time was flexible. They study, learn, wait, and act again. The operational commander, not just the assassins, would surface with time, but this was no time to rest. On that note, the professor told Doc to get some rest himself. He needed it, and certainly deserved it. Doc closed his eyes, but they both knew he would not sleep until they were in a designated safe house surrounded by trusted associates. The professor had started to take it all in ethologically, French and Latin for the character of human and animal beings. He had known Doc for many years, and knew it would be a fatal mistake to take his thinking lightly. The professor thought for a moment. We all die one day, but this situation was practically unbearable. On the other hand, he had Doc for protection. But would it be enough? Chapter 3. Home of Comfort and Safe Haven. The plane landed at Stewart International Airport in upstate New York, a generally serene environment where landowners and farmers had lived for generations. Many people, tired of the Manhattan rat race a mere few hours south by car, would drive up on occasion to take advantage of the beautiful mountains and the land to recharge their batteries. The professor and Doc were met at a standing helicopter by two fully armed pilots. They were soon in the air, en route to their safe house. The property was developed exactly for this situation. It consisted of 25 acres of land with breathtaking views of both the surrounding fields and the Shawangunk Mountains. It was a perfect place to regroup and recover from the past disconcerting few days in the Middle East. The compound was self-sufficient in all respects, including utilities, solar panels, housing, large and small residential structures, a 2-acre pond, and an extensive cutting-edge camera system. It also contained discreetly heavy and light weapons of all kinds, as well as hidden underground tunnels exiting in several directions for fast departures. Food rations, water, horses, mobile transportation, helicopter pads, and sophisticated communications systems were all in place with redundancy. An invisible electric perimeter fence, wattage dependent on circumstances, unrecognizable to even the professional eye, provided an added measure of security. During the next couple of days, the professor reviewed his schedule and also reviewed Doc's personnel file mentally yet again. The professor had the capacity to absorb and retain information flows almost effortlessly. However, in some respects, the Doc's personality was a Rubik's Cube. The professor first met Doc when Doc was only 16 years old. At the time, the professor was a visiting professor at Columbia University, a strolling, virtual, small metropolis of its own in the heart of New York City. While walking on a side street in Harlem, the professor had been suddenly surrounded by 3 rough men demanding his money and his clothes. One punched the professor in the stomach and tore off his coat. Another of the men put a switchblade to the professor's throat. Doc was walking across the street with one of his older sisters on their way to the university. He saw what was happening, flagged a nearby taxi, and told the driver to take his sister to the Columbia University entrance. Then he crossed the street. Doc, full-grown and about 190 pounds of solid muscle, stepped into the circle and told the men that they'd had their fun and they should move along. The professor was his uncle. The leader of the 3 looked at Doc, then laughed. He said that they'd just been released from prison and he had better disappear or they'd put him in the hospital, or kill them both. Doc nodded and stared at the man holding the knife to the professor's neck, where a slow but steady stream of blood was running. He slowly lifted his hands, saying he wanted no trouble. He then stepped back and slammed the ball of his foot into the knee of the man with the knife. He crumbled with his leg inverted. Doc threw an uppercut to his chin and snatched the stiletto, now in the air. Doc moved in on the leader before the first man even hit the ground and butted the center of his face hard. Lights out. Doc then spun and swung his right elbow into the temple of the third assailant. Within 3 or 4 seconds, all 3 men were on the ground, totally unconscious. Doc grabbed the professor, his coat, and his wallet, and moved him quickly away. He took out several Band-Aids from his coat pocket and placed them with pressure on the professor's throat. The bleeding stopped, and Doc told him to get the cut cleaned when he could. The professor, dazed by the speed and viciousness of the counterattack, kept looking back at the 3 fallen men. When they arrived at the university gate, Doc told the professor to take taxis from now on, and walked away. The professor was still in shock, and all he could mumble was a broken, high-pitched, "Thank you." Spotting him again from afar, the professor saw Doc wearing a subtle smile. The professor vowed to never forget that young man. He remembered vaguely seeing Doc's sister in the taxi as she got out and it drove away. The professor found her walking with a friend on the university grounds a few days later. He introduced himself and said her younger brother had gotten him out of a jam, and he just wanted to thank him properly. The sister, whose name was Beth, told him that her brother was generally very hard to locate, but she promised to pass on the professor's gratitude. The professor realized she was protecting her brother. Calculating the odds, the professor figured he would be unlikely ever to see Doc again, but in his mind, he somehow felt there was still a small probability. Chapter 4. Fate Comes Together. A few years later, on one of his earliest overseas missions, the professor was told by his superiors that he would have several U.S. Secret Service personnel accompany him to ensure his safety. The professor said that he did not want such support. It would inhibit discussions with his contacts abroad, and also make him uncomfortable, and therefore less effective. After considerable debate, it was decided that the professor would have just one security expert with him at all times, who would appear to be simply an executive assistant. When the introductions occurred, the professor and Doc were equally dumbfounded, as each remembered the other. Their superiors had mentioned to the professor that Doc was one of their most unusual and effective operatives. He had a remarkable record for someone his age, with an impressive number of difficult kills in action, KIAs. If the professor followed his guidance to the letter, they were quite confident that he would be safe. Following that mission, the professor requested that Doc always accompany him on sensitive trips, both domestically and internationally. He'd also been given Doc's full U.S. government physical and psychological jacket. The read in the file was extensive. It described Doc as an imposing young man at 6'4" and 225 pounds in top physical condition. He was not just in good shape, but also in fighting shape. The difference it cited between these two conditions, good shape and fighting shape, was critical when threats occurred. Professional athletes can be in top physical condition, but that does not mean that they are fighters. Even a talented boxer, for example, is a fighter of sorts in the ring and able to go 15 rounds in a bout when needed. But once in the ring, only certain punches or strikes are allowed. Doc understood that no such restrictions existed in his training or in his business in the U.S. military. Being in fighting shape was always a constant for Doc, as was keeping his street smarts honed at all times. His expertise in firearms of all kinds, knives, blades, scalpels, and poisons, was also fully developed. More importantly, Doc had been trained to see attacks coming prior to an adversary's first move, and he learned to excel at it effortlessly. As the professor read on, it was clear that Doc also emanated a very dangerous presence. In public, civilians tended to unconsciously look away rather than make eye contact, and yet at the same time, many again unconsciously were pulled toward him, as if he provided some sort of aura of safety and protection. Real professionals in public would make him out initially as military, likely Special Forces, SOF, or an intelligence officer, or perhaps even a federal law enforcement type. Upon further review, they might discount initial impressions and surmise he did some serious prison time. This was due to various, but somewhat faded, slight scars on his face and arms, as well as his general overall comportment. Whatever the case, he was always seen as someone nobody wanted to ever confront or challenge. Even mental psychopaths, sociopaths, and professionals that were quite comfortable with extreme violence tended to avoid him. The psych review concluded that he was an active with a quiet interior, which permitted only a limited number of close friends, and respected authoritative figures and superiors. However, it was also emphasized that he had an explosive side to his nature, a boundless, external, lethal capacity that was, best kept, for the most part, under wraps. There was, in the psych professional's estimation, about a 1% chance that if provoked due to a continuous, massive amount of stress and extreme danger, he would become unhinged for a short while. Such an explosion would most likely destroy any bad actors or adversaries within his radius. At the same time, he would still continue to protect anyone he perceived as truly honorable. Doc's makeup included extremely fast mental calculations that were simply extraordinary. He liked to focus his approach as follows. Rule number 1. Weapons are either at the ready or are improvised instantly in service to the following tactics: surprise, speed, and violence of action, and then a fast retreat with his principal, in that order. Rule number 2. Time is the overall vital ingredient to survival. Rule number 3. Never, ever give up, no matter the odds. Psychological youth background and development. Doc was born one of 9 children, 6 sisters and 3 brothers. He was the first male. His father was a highly decorated U.S. Army foot soldier with multiple medals awarded, 2 Purple Hearts and 1 Bronze Star, for combat in World War II. His mother was a homemaker. Shortly after the war, his father was honorably discharged, and he very happily came home to his wife and children. They all lived in a very small apartment in Bronx, New York. Their 3-bedroom apartment had 2 sets of bunk beds. These were for the girls, with 3 girls in each bedroom, and Doc slept on the living room sofa along with the 2 smaller children. Their parents had a very small bed in what was considered a 1 ultra-small storage room that was half the size of either of the 2 full bedrooms. Despite their cramped environs, Doc's family was a happy one. All the children especially enjoyed their father coming home at the end of his 2nd week of work, when he got his paycheck. He would bring home bags of food and a few goodies like ice cream and chocolate. Their mother doled out the treats in proportion to how well each of them were doing in school. The one who was doing best was given a very slight portion above the rest and had talking rights. Then, the father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and was dead in 5 days. At age 5, Doc was told that he was now the man in the family. His mother said he was responsible for all, in accordance with the Irish tradition at the time. Doc had taken this to heart, and it had a profound effect on his psychological makeup. He now saw his mother and sisters and baby brothers in a new light. He registered everything he could about each of them. He watched how they were, both when alone and with each of them separately. How they were with outside friends and non-friends. The non-friends were his keenest concern, so he studied them carefully without his siblings knowing it. Psychiatrist comment. This has, as a result, placed Doc into a special and lifelong conundrum. Doc, as an extremely young child, was forced to understand serious and heavy questions about life very early on. Most of all, he felt the weight of ensuring that his mother, his sisters, and the 2 infant boys were always protected. Doc has since applied it to himself as an adult by way of answering a couple of self-devised theoretical questions. When one is born into this life, are they here to do many, good or bad, acts to themselves or to other people? Or are they specifically here for one act and one act alone? If so, when this one act has been completed, is their time on this planet done?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?